Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Oxford Policy Pod. My name is Meredith Lehman, and I'm a student of public policy here at the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School, and I'm joined today with my fellow classmate, Felix Wu.
Hey, everyone.
So today we're thrilled to welcome Pepper Culpepper, the Vice Dean for Academic Affairs and Blavatnik Professor of Government and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. He's also a professorial fellow at Newfield College. Pepper's work sits at the intersection of capitalism and democracy, examining how corporate power shapes political outcomes and how democratic institutions push back. He is the award-winning author of Quiet Politics and Business Power, and has written extensively on business power, financial regulation, and comparative political economy. His latest book, co-authored with Taeku Lee, is Billionaire Backlash: The Age of Corporate Scandal and How It Can Save Democracy. And it will feature heavily in our conversation today. So again, thank you for joining us, Pepper.
Oh, I'm so delighted to be here. Thanks for having me, Meredith.
So I guess just to start out, we're really interested in talking about some of the ideas from your book today, and we wanted, to just sort of open the floor for you to share some of the main themes that come through.
Great. So the main themes, I think, you'll get from the top hat on the cover that there's out in opinion, there's this idea that a lot of people are concerned about the role that corporations have in modern life. They've done a lot of amazing things for us. They brought us the internet. AI is bringing us new capacities every day. But a lot of the companies that are running these new formidable technologies, thinking of Amazon, thinking of Google, thinking of Apple, thinking of Meta/Facebook. They've got very, very big, and they play this preponderant role in our life. Now, we've always had corporations involved in our lives, but the technology companies have really concentrated attention on this, and I think there's a lot of concern out in public opinion about the role these technology companies have, how AI will be governed or not governed in terms of what it's allowed to do. And that is becoming more and more manifest. And what we were interested in is when that opinion that's largely latent becomes manifest and becomes politically consequential. And so that's really the theme of the book. And the other sort of question, which we could maybe talk about later, is how we think about this political moment in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere, when we have this sort of latent opinion that comes out in politics. What does it make us think of? Are we in the 1930s, as many people would have us think, where we have kind of these armed militia groups in the street, loosely associated with the state, that people say are potentially, the precursor of democracy falling back in some of the richest democracies, including the United States? Or are we more like in 1900, which is the beginning of the progressive era in the United States, which is when you'd had the first technological revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and huge trusts that completely dominated politics, the way many of the technology companies and financial companies dominate politics today. And then we had a reassertion of state power vis-a-vis these companies. And we tend to think that there's a lot of similarities between that period and the current period, if there are moments in political opinion when policy entrepreneurs can take these and run with them. And that's a really big theme of the book as well. Yeah,
something that was sort of also quite relevant seemed to be how corporations and the backlash that can come from their decision making, they're sort of have a unique profile compared to other forms of scandal. And so can you go into that a little bit more?
That's absolutely right. Thank you for bringing that up. So why do we focus on corporate scandals as opposed to what you might think, being political scientists? In politics, the most consequential scandals should be political scandals. And in fact, we argue that many political scandals today are not as consequential politically. So Watergate, back in the 1970s, the early 1970s, was an extremely consequential scandal. A president resigned under the threat of impeachment, Richard Nixon, and that really changed politics. And there was the Profumo affair in the 1960s in Britain, which was similarly consequential, which brought down a minister and eventually the Macmillan government. So those scandals were really consequential. But if you look at modern scandals, and we talk a lot about the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky scandal, which has some similarities to Profumo in that it involves sex and politicians lying about it. But it didn't change opinion in the same way that the Watergate scandal did or the Profumo scandal did, because now that we are polarized, we're especially polarized in the United States, but we're heavily polarized in the United Kingdom. Polarization is a phenomenon in many of the advanced democracies. And corporate scandals, unlike, say, political scandals, they tend to have a resonance that's very much the same in the left and the right. People say, this is outrageous. We have to do something about it. What is the role of the state? And that's why we think corporate scandals in this particular moment are important, because they're one of the few times when we all come together with a relatively similar view. So Democrats or Republicans in the United States, or labor or conservatives here in this country, they'll have very different reactions. They're getting very different news sources. So they'll have different stories to tell each other. They've got the same story during corporate scandals.
So you mentioned news sources there. What do you see as the role of media in this framework that you're describing? Because for some of these scandals that you talk about in the book, it's in a rather esoteric area. Maybe it's about, how Wall Street functions, or it's about emissions, like these kinds of, subjects that folks may not be thinking about just day to day. So it's kind of up to the media it's up to the media to translate that for.
Right. I love that question, Felix. Thank you, because it's so important when you're doing something like emissions regulation, or when you're doing something like privacy regulation. Most people, they may have concerns about privacy. They may have concerns about climate change, or about environmental pollution and environmental degradation, but they don't have specific ideas about how policymaking should work. And so it's really important that journalists in this moment, they're our teachers. They tell us what's going on. They take this moment when people are actually paying attention and saying, for example, during the Dieselgate scandal, when Volkswagen had put a defeat device on its cars, such that when they were tested, they showed different emissions. They actually had different emissions than when they were actually on the road. And that was eventually discovered through a scandal that we talk about in the book, that became known as Dieselgate. And they had been marketing in the United States something called clean diesel. So they were clearly defrauding consumers. And eventually the EPA comes down on them for this scandal, which is discovered. And in that moment, it's the job of the media to instruct us, to tell us what's going on. And so that translation function is hugely important. And I think it's hugely important in the earlier media age, when we weren't quite so fragmented, and it's still important now. And I think one of the problems is, as you've had much of the income in media flowing into a couple of big companies, Google and Facebook / Meta, which are, generate ginormous advertising revenues. That's media companies that are not generating those revenues. They can't pay all the reporters that do that job, that do that translation. So one of the challenges is making sure that we get good investigative reporters who can expose these stories for us.
Sort of on the same topic. I'm wondering how trust in media sort of plays into this, because along with increasing bipartisanship in the United States and across the world, also something that's been really prolific is a rising distrust in traditional media outlets. Recently, there was a Gallup poll that said 7 in 10 adults in the United States describe their trust in media as not very much or none at all. And so I'm wondering what implications this might hold for government and corporate accountability in your framework.
It's a great question. My daughter is a journalist at the Lehman Foundation at Harvard, and she puts this question to me. We talk weekly, and so I get it about once a month, because, we studied, the evolution of trust in media as part of the work that we were doing, and trust in the media tends to march in lockstep with trust in the other major institutions. And that is to say, it's been marching downwards over the past several decades, at least in the advanced democracies. And so trust in media is declining, and that therefore undermines the ability of media to be this sort of impartial spokesperson that I'm talking about. But that's partially because, I would argue, things have become so politicized, and people are in different informational spheres when they're getting their information. I think you'll find that we fall back on our habits of looking for the media to inform us during moments when we don't really understand something. So I think the media will still benefit from that, even as this sort of ongoing cycle is undermining trust in real time in what people believe. And eventually, if that goes on long enough, I think that damage is done to democracy and our ability to have, if you like, a common epistemic space. And this is one of the challenges we talk about, having a common epistemic space, so that we can disagree about what policy should be adopted, but we can agree about the frameworks in which we're discussing it, what the underlying facts are.
Right.
That's very hard to do when you have everyone siloed in a particular sphere. And so that's one of the problems that we talk about in the conclusion, as being really important for democracies to get themselves back up on their feet.
Yeah.
So backtracking a little bit, in your audiobook, at least, you talk a bit with your co-author Taeku about just how you came upon this theory in the first place, and how both of you kind of have different approaches to political science, of different disciplines, different research focus areas. Can you tell us a bit more about how the two of you work together on this, and how you put your heads together with the different types of research that you do?
Yeah. So we're both political scientists, but we kind of see the world differently. Uh, I study political economy. I study interest groups and how policy gets made. And I have generally thought of elections as these things that happen periodically that don't tend to be very important, because what really matters is interest groups having conflict that they line up behind certain actors during elections. But what's really matters is the sort of ongoing interest group conflict, and, if you like, the underlying power resources that that they're able to mobilize in politics. That's not the world that Taeku sees at all. He sees a world that's very much made up of individual voters with a set of concerns that are activated at certain moments or not activated at other moments. And he's very interested in movements in individual opinion, how political parties motivate them. And so, if you like, if you want to make a methodological point, sorry to bore readers, Taeku has a very individualistic focus on what actually makes individuals move. How do we look at individual voters? And I have much more of a collectivist focus on how do these groups have conflict together. We're both, if you like, methodological individualists, in that we both see how it is that individuals are represented by groups or represented by parties, but we have different levels of research focus. And that meant that working together, we would have these conversations in each other's offices, where he would say something and I would have to pause and translate what he had said into my language, and then say it back to him. And then he would say, well, that's not exactly what I mean. And so it was a long process of understanding where each other was coming from. But because we're interested in what's happening with public opinion, how public opinion can actually be disciplining of these big forces in democracy, it's sort of the convergent point in Billionaire Backlash is our two interests, in how you bring individuals into politics, and what are the moments when they kind of rise up. And so, as we say in the audiobook, this really started first when Taeku read a draft of Quiet Politics when we were both junior scholars at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he said, "Yeah, could be true. I'm not sure it is." And so, yeah, of course, these are big fighting words among professors, and so
Right.
we've had a long argument about that since. More proximately, we began to look at post-financial crisis, what was going on. I was, by that time, living in Europe, in Italy. I was teaching at the European University Institute. Taeku was teaching at the University of California at Berkeley, and I saw and was focused on all of the sort of post-crisis anger that had been brought up. If you like, Main Street versus Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, that notion, as well as the European debt crisis. I was seeing people really angry at banks, really angry at these big institutions, and turning things over. And Taeku said, well, let's see what's going on in public opinion. And we first looked at sort of big views towards markets and regulation, and not a lot had changed, pre and post crisis. But we thought, there's still a lot of angry people. So how do we look at that? And then we began to focus and we began to narrow in on attitudes towards corporations, warmth towards corporations and executives. And that was kind of the moment we realized corporate scandals are the way that people channel this outrage, and the way they put a personal face on political discontent. And that was the breakthrough moment that sort of started a research trajectory in 2014-15 that eventually led to this book.
Mm-hmm.
So you're mentioning, collective action, groups of people getting together in sort of this moral outrage. And one of the things that crossed my mind while reading this book was how much the sort of like critical mass of of public matters as compared to what group of the public is expressing their anger at a certain action of a corporation, for example. So what do you think that balance is? Is it more about amassing a large number of people together towards a common cause, or is more of the focus sort of on what group of society you're in, how much sort of power you hold?
Yeah, that's a big question because you're basically asking about the difference between elite and mass opinion. And on a lot of questions, elite opinion tends to be dominant. However, the questions where it's not dominant is when the mass has a strong, concentrated point of view. And so the debates in elite opinion tend to be about the details of policy. How are we going to do, various subsidies? How are we going to make nudges, et cetera? Mass opinion is much less focused than that on these particular details. And the mass opinion is somewhat different from the elite opinion. Elites tend to be, at least in the work that I've seen on the United States and some European countries, elites tend to be a little more market friendly than the masses. Elites tend to be a little more, pro free trade, for example, than mass opinion is. So when mass opinion gets locked in, it can overturn this elite consensus, and you could see the sort of revolution that is represented by Donald Trump in the United States as mass opinion has had, has a view on globalization that has not been a fair deal. That elite opinion was quite happy with that because most elites were benefiting from that deal, whether they were on the political right or the political left. And so we're very much focused on mass opinion, but that doesn't mean that we don't think that elite opinion takes its cues in some sense from mass opinion and kind of adjusts in response to it. But mass opinion and what's going on in the latent public is what we think is really important. We think that the elites have got a lot of things wrong recently, and the push from the mass is what we think is the promising thing to look for, as well as some of the dangers that we see in populism.
Yeah. So with the current administration, the Trump administration, I think many of our listeners, many of your readers might think, well, this seems to be an administration that's quite shameless about scandal, right? That it seems like when they, there's the rare instance where they do back down, with Trump, posting a video of the Obamas as apes, for instance, right? But for the most part, it seems like a lot of times it's another week, it's another outrage, and they lean into it. So, how do you think about that as someone who's been parsing through different scandals and how they intersect with politics and mass opinion?
Yeah, it's a really good opinion. It's a really good question. I actually think that President Trump is very effective at seizing information, seizing the sort of attention and the understanding the importance of attention in the modern economy. And I think that a lot of other elites have not caught up with President Trump, and that's why he's been so effective in his sort of political career. Having said that, a lot of what's going on seems outrageous to a lot of people, and we kind of address in the audiobook in one of the extra sessions, how do we think about, because of course the book was published largely, and right before the election, or was largely written before the election, and so it's just the early months of the election that we were able to observe. And one of the questions that we ask in the extra sessions to the audiobook is, but there's so many scandals about conflict of interest around Donald Trump, his association in particular with the crypto industry, his own meme coins, Liberty Financial, World Liberty Financial, and conflicts of interest there, and these conflicts of interest have continued to come out. And the way we understand why that conflict of interest has not really caught fire in public opinion is for exactly what I was talking about earlier when we were talking about the difference between Clinton and Watergate, that this is seen in a very partisan lens. And so when you get coverage right now of the conflicts of interest in the Trump administration, there's, if you like, a Fox News view, which is the right-wing view, and there's a New York Times CNN view, which is the left-wing view. And, the New York Times CNN view which is the view of many students of this school, this is outrageous. How could people not be upset about it? That is not the Fox News view. The Fox News view is, this is business as normal, what the elites have always been doing on Wall Street, and why should we, condemn the president for it? Because he's so good at his job. And I'm not going to take a view on those two positions, but because those stories are so different, I think that this is a question where Meredith's question about elite and mass opinion comes back. I think we see the media very much leading opinion, and there's a story in the book about crypto and how we see that to be the case in these complex policy areas. And that's what's going on in the sort of conflict of interest case, where it's so polarized that you haven't yet had a breakthrough. I think Epstein suggests the Epstein scandal is one place where you've had a sort of coalescence of the left and the right thinking similar things about what's going on. And the similar things they think are that the elites are really screwing us all over.
Yeah. So on the Epstein file scandal, it's hard to really pinpoint though what really is the policy. There's maybe some anti-elitism in terms of how everyday folks are interpreting the scandal, but it's hard to pinpoint kind of in the same way maybe with the Volkswagen scandal. You can easily say, all right, well, it seems like there's some corporate malfeasance there with auto companies, or you're not being transparent with regulators. What do you think is kind of the policy outcome that maybe results from this Epstein scandal that we've seen unfold over many years now, and that seems to unite some Republicans and Democrats in their outrage?
So it's a great question because corporate scandals are so effective because they are bipartisan in the sense, or nonpartisan in the sense that they're often covered. And they have a clear villain figure. There's a villain narrative. These journalists who've been telling us stories, the story they generally tell us is VW bad. They've been cheating consumers for a long time and regulators for a long time. We have to do something about that, right? Same thing, Facebook, very lazy about sort of supervising data, and we've got to do something about this. Simple stories where there's a concentrated villain, and it's got a face, whether that face is the head of VW or it's the head of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. Epstein has a face with it, Epstein, but he's dead, and so
Allegedly.
Oh, God.
I thought you were going to say allegedly about the suicide, but indeed, allegedly, that's a whole nother level of conspiracy theory. Okay, but let's take it as read that he's dead, whether that's true or not. The question of kind of policy implications is a really hard one to answer because it's not obvious what the policy implications are. I think, however, if, like me, you're a student of populism and you're interested in what people think about populism, what you're getting is a real hardening of views towards the elite. And in fact, the disconnect I talked about before, where many elites have an opinion on the desirability of free trade that is not the mass opinion, that view that the elites don't really share the same interests we do is hardening in public opinion. And I think the possibility, though it's by no means certain that this is going to happen, but the possibility is that this is the backdrop to some other scandal, which or event. It doesn't need to be a scandal, but some other event that could really concentrate public opinion. And I would sort of enumerate two that are possible. One is an AI crash. The AI crash can be in terms of what it does to the economy, and you have something like the financial crash. It could be all of these stranded data centers, which are raising everyone's power bills. It could be effects on water. There's so many ways that AI could interact with society in a very suddenly negative way in 2026. That's one area it could focus on, and then crypto is another area where Bitcoin has been going down. It's been crypto all moved up, and Bitcoin kind of represents the move of the crypto market. It went up post-Trump, and now it's gone down. And if there's suddenly a crash where a bunch of people get hurt, but the president and his family have made a lot of money, that's another sort of potential focusing event. That focusing event, I think, will rest on the back of the hardening against all elites that we've seen in the Epstein files. And so I think it's not that there's an obvious if you like, policy target that comes out of Epstein. We don't really know what to do about it. But people have said, in fact, the elites really do have different views than the masses, and we may need sort of a different policy.
Well, so you sort of mentioned a few things in that response, but one of them was your reference to that part of corporate scandals' effectiveness. The part of that effectiveness is its apolitical nature, its apolitical characterization.
Nonpartisan. I wouldn't say apolitical.
Yeah, yes, not nonpartisan. And so, but do you think that this nonpartisan nature could perhaps be shifting? I mean, consider, for example, a figure like Elon Musk and his stint with the Doge in the White House, or the the infamous photo of the tech billionaires sort of flanking Trump at his inauguration. Do you think that that's having an impact on the way that latent opinion interprets these large corporations and their scandals, or are people? Do you think people are separating these figureheads from the corporations themselves?
Yeah, I think I would distinguish between Elon Musk, who is a clearly politicized figure, and the picture you saw at the inauguration with all of well, with many of the major leaders, Sundar Pichai, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, all lined up behind. I think that Pichai and Zuckerberg and Bezos are desperately trying to protect their companies from state intervention. They understand that they were perceived as being left before, and so they're trying to simply say, no, actually we can work with this government, and they're trying to say that actually this government has interests that are very closely associated with what we do, because we're big American companies. And where's all the investment growth happening in the American economy right now? It's basically happening with these big 7 companies. And so that's a very credible frame, and they're doing it because they know that President Trump is very mercurial and can decide to sort of suddenly turn on them. And indeed, he's played this game with Mark Zuckerberg where he's supported Facebook while challenging them in court, continuing antitrust challenges that he inherited from the Biden administration. So I think Trump is playing a complex game with the leaders of tech, but I think in the past few months, it seems more and more like he's pro-big tech and less a populist. And I think that that's going to become a problem for him as a politician, thinking about how do I deal with my base, what's called MAGA in the United States, given how pro-big tech I have been, and therefore contrary to what a lot of, say, governors of red states, want, which is, for example, some regulation of AI. To go back to your question about Elon Musk, super partisan figure, which was not the case 3 or 4 years ago. That was not, Elon Musk was not seen as necessarily a Republican or a Democrat figure. He's very much thrown his lot in with the president, Doge, chainsaw, etc. He's made big changes. He's come out not only in favor of right-wing politics in the United States, but in favor of right-wing politics in Europe. Attacked a lot of European governments, saying that they are, basically selling out the West, etc. And so I don't think Musk is a sort of figure that crosses over from the economy and into politics, because he's so important, and he's almost a Bond villain in the sense that he's sort of occupied this role, especially for those on the left, of just trying to tear down government. Why is he tearing down government? Because government regulates a lot of the things that he does. It regulates SpaceX, it regulates Tesla. And so a lot of his cuts at Doge are indistinguishable from the things that he does in terms of trying to escape regulation with these individual companies. Not to mention that when you cut the power of the IRS, the Revenue Service of the United States, that diminishes its ability to collect taxes. And who should be paying a lot of taxes? Well, Elon Musk, because he's got a lot of money, and given a progressive tax system. And so I think that there you have, he has become totally wrapped up with politics, and he's considered a very partisan figure there. But I think the tech guys will still try to position themselves, if there's a swing back towards the left in the next U.S. election, either at the midterms or the next president, they will try to reposition themselves. The question is whether public opinion has moved away from them and sees them now as, not really credible, and where the Democratic Party sees them as well.
Yeah. You mentioned something interesting in there that I'd like to touch on again, which was the sort of recent shift towards playing in favor of big tech companies and the U.S. government, like this sort of move from populism to big tech favoritism. And yeah, AI specifically seems to be treated differently than a lot of other technology out there. And I think a big part of this is that the race for AGI narrative, this idea that the U.S. must move quickly to compete with China, is often invoked to sort of argue against any form of regulation. And we've seen that in the form of executive orders, sort of overriding state regulation in December, for example. And I'm wondering how you see this framing, this this framing shaping the political treatment of AI? And is this urgency around global competition being used to override or delegitimize these regulatory efforts that might otherwise have gained traction? And so I don't know if you have been thinking about these firms in sort of a separate way from other technology firms.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with your analysis. So it used to be the case that these companies would say, anytime there was an attack on them, like with, for example, the privatization, the privacy policy initiative in California. Well, what do? They formed the California Committee to Protect Jobs, and so they put it around job creation, and so job creation is not really credible in a technology that's going to render a lot of people jobless. And so what's been the justifying strategy? Competition with China. We're going to lose the competition with China. And so, therefore, the interests of the United States will be deeply and fundamentally undermined. Is that credible or not credible? I'm not certain, but it's certainly being instrumentalized to push against what 65 to 70% of the people want, which is some guardrails put on AI. And so you'll actually see it's Republican governors as well as Democratic governors who are trying to get some more regulations at the state level. And this executive order that you talked about was a sort of fallback measure after President Trump failed to get this into a law at the federal level to keep states from being able to make law. And I think that's not going to work. And I think that's the real pressure point in the coalition right now of the current U.S. government between MAGA, represented by, say, Steve Bannon, who hates these tech bros and who always talks about hating these tech bros, and the tech bros themselves, and Peter Thiel, their high priest. And so these things are going to pull apart, and the tech bros are, if you like, pulling away from where public opinion is, and that creates a lot of tension for the ruling coalition. They're only lucky because their Democratic counterparts have been absolutely ineffectual in rallying opposition, and so that ineffectualness has sort of left them a little space.
I mean, it's also worth mentioning, though, that there are some major players sort of in the megasphere that are sort of intimately intertwined with people like Peter Thiel, for example. Like JD Vance would be one of them, and I think also their like technology, the person in charge of technology policy also formerly worked for him. So there's like
David Sachs.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah.
Yep.
And so there is kind of, I don't know, some tension even within the megasphere, perhaps.
I mean, the tension runs right down the middle of J.D. Vance's body.
Yeah.
Right? Now, he comes from Appalachia, is a spokesperson for MAGA. I mean, with Josh Hawley, who's a senator from Missouri. He was the sort of most prominent spokesperson for we've got to restrain technology, and he's gone very quiet about that. J.D. Vance is playing a game. He's one of the two most probable successors to Trump with Marco Rubio. And therefore he's trying to position himself, and he's a politician, so he knows which way the wind is blowing inside the administration. But the way the wind is blowing inside the administration and the way it blows in the public opinion, which is what got Trump into office in the first place, that's going to create tension for these guys. And I think how they confront it and how the opposition, meaning the Democrats, responds to it is key to determining where politics goes at the midterms and beyond.
Yeah. So I do think that Meredith is right, that I think a lot of folks put AI in kind of a separate category, this new genre of technology, if you will, that folks use. But do you think many Americans have made up their minds about it, or is it ripe for a scandal to happen such that there's an opportunity for a policy entrepreneur, as you described them? There's opportunity for Republicans, for Democrats, to get a political edge or get something passed on the issue of AI? Or is it one of these things that there's some entrenched opinions and maybe there's not as much room for movement?
So the survey work I have seen suggests that there is implicit distrust of AI and a feeling that it's going unregulated and needs to be regulated. That is a sentiment that doesn't sit on a lot of knowledge. Most people don't understand AI. Their interaction with AI is entirely through LLMs like ChatGPT. And so they don't really know about what the kind of labor market implications are. They don't know about the resource use implications for, water and energy and what this is going to displace. and they don't really know, what the kind of too big to fail implications are of these
Mm.
companies in the economy. And so
Absolutely.
a crash of some sort, a crashing of the bubble, which may or may not happen, I tend to think it is going to happen this year,
Yeah.
is something that would really concentrate opinion on that in a certain way. And so this implicit distrust of AI that you see in polling data where people want some kind of regulation would then glom onto a more concrete view about these are big companies who are trying now to get the government to bail them out, or pay for the things that they overinvested in with all of these data centers that they're not going to be able to use,
Yeah.
because they were sort of chasing a dream as to how they were going to be profitable. So what exactly the shape of that pushback will be, I don't know. But I think it will be, the shape of the pushback will determine what the public decides about AI. I don't think the public's mind is made up. I think it's just, it's a latent view right now.
I do think also, yeah, you've just made me think about data centers and their prevalence in especially rural communities in the United States. I'm from a rural region of the United States, so this is something that's sort of top of mind for me. But yeah, I do think that those regions, especially right now, at least from my just observation, have been engaging a lot with what data centers might mean for the environment or for use of water, for example.
Or their power bills. Their
resources.
power bills
Yeah,
are going up. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. So it is interesting that region is sort of starting to experience those things first. Yeah.
And there's also this issue of, this was brought to my attention by someone I talked to in an interview the other day who said, in many places they are getting local officials to sign NDAs about the data centers that are being built. And they're claiming they're doing this so that people don't raise prices on them when they buy the land. But in fact, you're starting to get them trying to use not NDAs or non-disclosure agreements, such that public officials are not able to tell their constituents information they need to know about what's happening to development in their community. So this is a kind of roiling area underneath that speaks to some of the broader questions in politics, and not just about the simple issue of AI. It's about, who represents us.
Absolutely. And with that capacity already sort of diminished in a lot of these, the Appalachian region of the United States or Rust Belt region of the United States, both of which I'm also from, so are of interest to me. But yeah, there you already have this diminished political capacity because of the deindustrialization, et cetera. And so I think they tend to be rendered much more vulnerable to these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. We know you've studied state capacity, and we know that some of these poor areas in the United States. I was born in Louisiana. Louisiana has terrible state capacity because it's been hollowed out. And so, how well does the Louisiana state government negotiate with Facebook or Meta when it wants to build its Hyperion, huge data center in Louisiana? They're saying, "Wow, this sounds great to us. Looks like a lot of money." It's not necessarily a lot of jobs, and it may worsen the situation of a lot of people in Louisiana. But it's hard when you don't have that kind of capacity, the sort of capacity we try to build at the school.
Yeah.
Yeah. One curious phenomenon I think I see with the Trump administration too, and this goes back to AI as well, is just in their engagement with corporate America. I think with prior administrations, Republican or Democrat, a lot of negotiations, a lot of deal making happened behind closed doors. But with the Trump administration, you do see CEOs kind of lined up, at the inauguration. You do see them very visibly being in the Oval Office, kissing the ring, presenting President Trump with some gift or another. And even in the case of AI, right, Trump is not shy about the fact that he's negotiating with NVIDIA, the NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, about export control. So with this kind of new dynamic we're seeing between the U.S. government and corporate America, if you had to play pundit or forecaster, how do you think that's going to change the way corporate scandals might be viewed down the line?
Yeah, I tend to look at these CEOs and think that these CEOs are doing what they've always done, which is to say they're figuring out what's good for their companies. When many of these companies that we're so surprised that showed up at the inauguration, so delighted to support Trump, who's on the right, when they had sort of vaunted these views of the left, say in 2020, those were partly responses to, they had, labor shortages, and they were trying to attract workers, and workers could demand a lot from them, including the positions they took. But those guys hate that. When I say those guys, I'm thinking of Mark Andreessen in particular, the venture capitalist from Silicon Valley. But they hate the surrender of control that involves.
Right.
And we've always known about senior tech executives, we had some good survey work on this, that they do not like labor unions and anything that sort of takes away managerial control. And these are managers running enormous corporations that are enormously valuable. And so they're figuring out ways for their enormous corporations to be successful, dominant, profitable in any walk of life. And so I think largely what's going to happen is they're going to be seen doing that. And it may change the views of some on the left, but it's always been the left that's been suspicious of these big corporations. And the alignment between tech companies and the left was always built on sand, not anything more solid than that. The question is, does it, I mean, the implicit question I heard behind your question was, does this mean that, suddenly every corporate scandal is is necessarily partisan? And I think that's one possibility. I think if we go down the road of kind of everything being seen in a partisan light, and companies seem to come to be seen in an increasingly partisan light, then any scandal could be interpreted in a partisan lens.
Right.
But I think a lot of, and this is what we talk about in the Good Populism chapter at the end, and we've done some additional empirical work on this. There's even often in the same voter, there are two kinds of populist tendencies. There's one which is about political failure, and this is the sort of view that agrees with the mainstream media is broken. It doesn't matter which party you elect, and there's a small and secretive group of individuals that run the world.
Right.
That populist view, whether on the left or on the right, is associated with negative views towards immigrants, towards minorities, and towards Jews. So if you go over to the other side of populism, which is worried about what's called the rigged system, this seems like a fundamentally unfair system. People say, elites only got the position they're in by playing a rigged system or cheating. That's much more about economic unfairness. And that view is very negative towards billionaires and towards large corporations, but it's very positive towards the same groups I mentioned before, immigrants, minorities, and Jews in particular. And if you look at the views towards small corporations, they're actually more positive towards small corporations because they think small corporations are victims also of the rigged system. Why am I telling you all this? Because when we look at this game of big corporations, I think it's all to play for that across left and right, everyone is trying to compete for the big vote that we call good populism, the sort of negative views towards other members of our community. Because when you're saying you don't like minorities, immigrants, and Jews, you're basically saying there's some members of the community who are not really parts of the community. And that undermines the political community because most of our liberal societies, and I'm using liberal in the liberal democratic sense, they depend on pluralism and the acceptance of some difference of identity as not being important, because what's important is citizenship and membership of the community. And so if you're going to accept that kind of populism, that's the sort of political failure type, that's going to be undermining of the pluralism that's necessary for liberal democracy to thrive. And if you're going to instead go for what we call good populism, that's going to be pretty bad for billionaires, but reinforcing of democracy. And we think political parties are going to start to bet on the other alternative.
Yeah. So before we close out here, you and Taeku, your co-author, chose to publish this as a book, right? And you're both political scientists. You chose not to publish this in some obscure political science research journal somewhere, right? So for someone who's not political, a political nerd like us, and they're picking this up at the bookstore, what are you hoping that they take away from this book?
Well, let me just say we published several articles in those nerd political science journals, and that's the kind of research on which it's based. But we wanted to write the book this way, in a way that's based on research, but that's widely accessible, because we think the story towards democracy is currently too negative. We think democracies have big problems. We outline many of them. In our own work, we've talked about, the advantages that corporations have in politics. Taeku's written a lot about the problems of political parties and their inability to mobilize their members. So we know that there are problems. But the discourse today is that democracies are fundamentally broken and can't be fixed. And actually, by looking at the structure of public opinion, we think the sort of simmering pushback towards big companies is a pro-capitalist but anti-domination pushback that really has a capacity to bring us back together. And that's why we point back to the progressive era in the United States. Progressive, small p, is shared across the Democrats and Republicans in the United States at that time, where there's a sense that if we're going to govern things as democracies, that means we make a decision that ultimately the people are sovereign. They have to make decisions, and the government has to implement those decisions. And so we want people to see that it's not the case that populism is uniquely negative. It's often a symptom that the elites have got too far from the masses, and the elites need to pull back and sort of reorient towards the masses, and they need to reorient in a way that's a little more challenging of the prerogatives of big companies and very, very large corporations. And that's where a lot of these elites have been aligned with, and so that's going to be challenging for these elites in the coming years. But we think that's the way things are going. And we think it's not an anti-capitalist message, it's a pro-capitalist message. But when everything is owned by Amazon and Google and Facebook, that's not pro-capitalism, that's monopoly. And monopoly is not capitalism at all.
Yeah. Well, on that cautiously optimistic note, I would say, the book is Billionaire Backlash. The co-authors are Taeku Lee and Pepper Culpepper. Pepper, thanks for being on with us.
Delightful to be on with both of you today. Thanks so much.